My daughter's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. Her fingers stayed suspended in the air for a moment, just a fraction of a second, before she set it down on the table very carefully, like she was suddenly aware of every small movement she was making. My name is Nora Scott, and I was 72 years old, sitting across from my daughter in the kitchen of the house she shared with her husband, watching her face do the math it hadn't expected to do that morning. The lawyer had called 40 minutes earlier. I hadn't told her that yet. I hadn't told her anything. I had simply asked if we could talk, driven over in my 12-year-old Civic, and sat down with the cup of coffee she'd poured me out of something that felt like habit more than hospitality. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't do any of the things a 72-year-old woman who had been living in her car 6 weeks ago might reasonably be expected to do when the ground shifts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. The morning my daughter told me nobody would hire me, it was raining. Not dramatically, just that flat, gray October rain that makes everything feel slightly defeated before it begins. I had been awake since 4 in the morning, which had become my routine by then, partly because the back seat of a Civic is not designed for sleeping, and partly because my mind wouldn't stop running calculations I didn't have enough information to complete. Her name is Delia. Delia Voss, that's her married name now, has been for 11 years. She got her father's nose and her grandmother's bluntness, and when she said what she wasn't being cruel. That's the part I want to be clear about because it matters to what came later. She genuinely believed it. She had looked at me, 67 pounds lighter than I was at 60, wearing a coat I had bought in 2014, sleeping in a parking structure off Route 9, and she had made a calculation that seemed to her like simple arithmetic. Mom, her voice had dropped the way it does when she's about to say something she's already decided she won't apologize for. Nobody hires you at this age. You need to stop looking and start figuring out how to manage what you have. What I had at that precise moment in time was $412 in a checking account, a car, and a phone. What I also had, and this is the part she did not know, was an appointment in 3 days with a forensic accountant named Clifton Ockeffer, who had spent the last 6 weeks going through 22 years of joint financial records that my attorney had pulled from Discovery. I didn't correct her. I looked out her kitchen window at the rain and I said, "You're probably right." And I watched the relief move across her face, and I noted it. To understand why her relief landed the way it did, you need to understand something about my marriage and about the 22 years I spent inside it. My ex-husband's name is Gerald Ferreira. He is 69 years old and he was, for most of our marriage, a genuinely intelligent man who was also quietly terrified of anyone who might surpass him. I did not understand this about him for a very long time. I understood it as a kind of protectiveness, then as a kind of insecurity I was supposed to manage, and then, finally, in the last 3 years of our marriage, as a structural fact, the load-bearing wall of who he was. Gerald was a commercial real estate developer. Mid-size, regional, profitable. He had built the business before we married, and I had, over the years, become fluent in every aspect of it, the financing structures, the zoning processes, the tenant relationships, without ever holding a title that reflected that fluency. I ran the household. I managed the rentals we had acquired together. I raised Delia. I had a real estate license I kept current and occasionally used, mostly to help friends and neighbors, never for anything that would have made Gerald feel like I was competing with him. That last part was deliberate. I want to be honest about that. The marriage ended when Gerald filed in the spring of 2 years ago. He cited irreconcilable differences, which was technically accurate in the way that calling the Atlantic Ocean a puddle is technically not a lie. What he did not disclose, what he had been building for, I believe, somewhere between 4 and 6 years, was the financial architecture he had constructed to ensure that when the marriage ended, I would receive the smallest possible fraction of what we had built together. My attorney, a family law and financial litigation specialist named Beverly Chun, was the first person who used the phrase hidden assets in my presence without it feeling abstract. She used it in our initial consultation on a Tuesday morning in November, 2 years ago, and she used it the way a doctor names a thing you already knew was wrong but hadn't had language for yet. The consulting fees, she said. She had a legal pad in front of her and she wrote a number on it and pushed it toward me. $480,000. Over 3 years. Paid to a company called Ferrera Strategic Partners LLC, which was registered in Delaware in 2020. Gerald Ferreira is the sole member. I looked at the number. Then I looked at Beverly Chun's face, which was entirely still, not cold, just professional in the way of someone who has seen this particular thing many times and has made a decision not to perform shock. He was paying himself, I said. He was paying himself, she confirmed. I had met Beverly Chun 8 months before the divorce was finalized, at the recommendation of a woman named Louise Tam, who had been my neighbor for 6 years, and who was, quietly, one of the most perceptive people I have ever known. Louise had gone through her own financial litigation 5 years earlier. She did not volunteer this information in general conversation. She told me over coffee on a Sunday morning after she had watched me decline, slowly and then all at once, over the course of 4 months following Gerald's filing. You need Beverly, Louise said. Not you should think about or you might want to consider. You need Beverly. Louise was not someone who softened things unnecessarily. I made the appointment the next morning. What Beverly found, and what Clifton Ockefer, her forensic accountant, spent the following months documenting with a level of precision that I found both impressive and faintly terrifying, was not simply that Gerald had hidden money. It was that he had done it methodically, in increments small enough to avoid obvious flags, over a period of time long enough that the pattern required genuine expertise to recognize. The $480,000 in consulting fees was the number Beverly had surfaced in Discovery. The full picture that Clifton was building was considerably larger. But I did not have the full picture yet when Delia told me nobody would hire me at my age. I had the $480,000 number. I had Beverly's preliminary read on the discovery documents. I had Clifton's timeline, 3 weeks to the completed forensic report, and I had Beverly's assessment, given to me in the measured tone she used for everything, that what she was seeing was significantly stronger than I initially anticipated. And I had $412 and a Civic. I want to be precise about the car situation because I know how it sounds. I could have asked Delia to stay with her while the proceedings continued. She had offered, in the early weeks, in a way that made the offer feel conditional on my compliance with her read of the situation, which was that I was a woman in my early 70s who had been dependent on a husband for 2 decades and needed to accept a reduced version of a life going forward. I did not argue with this because arguing would have required explaining things I was not yet ready to explain. So I thanked her and I slept in the car and I kept my phone charged and I showed up to every meeting Beverly scheduled. What I did not tell Delia, what I had not told anyone in the family, was that in the 3 months before Gerald filed, I had done something that felt, at the time, like a small act of self-preservation, and that turned out to be one of the most structurally significant decisions of my adult life. In January of 2 years ago, I had transferred the deed on the Millbrook Road rental property, a 4-unit building that Gerald and I had purchased together in 2008 and that I had managed entirely on my own for 14 years, into a family trust. My name was the trustee. Delia was the named beneficiary. I had done this with the help of an estate attorney named Raymond Suarez, who I had consulted privately after a conversation with Louise that had not been about divorce specifically, but had been, in retrospect, exactly about divorce. Raymond had a calm, unhurried quality that I found reassuring, and he had walked me through the trust structure over 2 meetings in his office on a Thursday afternoon in January and a Monday morning 2 weeks later. This is entirely within your rights as a co-owner, he told me, provided the transfer is documented and disclosed appropriately. He had paused. I'd recommend doing this sooner rather than later, given what you've described about the financial dynamics. The Millbrook Road property had been appraised at $420,000 the previous fall. Gerald's attorneys had challenged the transfer in discovery. Beverly had handled it. Delia did not know the property existed in a trust in her name. She did not know because I had not told her, and I had not told her because she had, by that point in our relationship, developed a set of opinions about my competence and my future that made certain conversations feel less like conversations and more like appeals I was filing to a court that had already ruled. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, someone who loved you, even in their way, you know exactly what that silence feels like. It is not the silence of weakness. It is the silence of someone who has decided that the evidence will speak and that it will speak more clearly than any argument she could make with words. I kept the trust quiet. I kept Beverly quiet. I kept Clifton quiet. And I drove to Delia's house in the rain and I said, "You're probably right," and I watched her relax and I noted it. The forensic accounting report came in on a Thursday. Clifton Ockefer had a way of presenting numbers that was both entirely without drama and somehow devastating. He would lay a figure on the table and let it sit there, and the silence around it would do all the work a more expressive person might have done with their voice. The total, once the full picture was documented, was not $480,000. It was closer to $1.1 million, distributed across a combination of the consulting fees, two investment accounts registered under Ferrera Strategic Partners, and a series of transfers to what appeared to be a separate personal account that Gerald had opened in his own name only, at a bank we had never used together, in a state we had never lived in. Beverly had gone through the report with me over 2 hours on a Friday morning in her office. She had a habit of tapping her pen against the edge of her legal pad when she was thinking, not nervously, just rhythmically, and she tapped it now as she walked me through each section. This changes the settlement picture substantially, she said. I assumed it would, I said. She looked at me for a moment. You're taking this very calmly. I've had a few weeks to get used to the shape of it. She nodded, tapped the pen once more, and moved to the next section. What I did not tell Beverly, what I had not told anyone, was that the calm was not indifference. It was something closer to relief, the specific relief of having your instincts confirmed after a long period of being told your instincts were not to be trusted. Gerald had been telling me, in one form or another, for the last several years of our marriage that my read of our finances was naive, that I didn't understand the complexity of what he managed, that the numbers I was seeing were a simplified version of a more sophisticated structure that was, unfortunately, too intricate to fully explain to someone without his background. He had been right that the numbers I was seeing were a simplified version. He had been wrong about the direction of the simplification. I called Delia that evening. I did not tell her about Clifton's report. I asked if I could come for dinner on Sunday, and she said yes, in the tone of someone extending an invitation they feel obligated to extend, and I said thank you and I hung up and I sat in the parking structure for a long time watching the lights come on in the building across the street. Then I called Beverly. Sunday dinner, I said. Delia's place. Her husband's parents are going to be there, his brother and his wife, the full table. Beverly was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about timing, I said, and I'm thinking that I would like to have the amended disclosure documents ready by Saturday afternoon. Another pause, then, I can make that work. Thank you. I sat in the car for another hour after that, not planning exactly, more like settling. The way you settle into something that has already been decided not by you, not recently, but by the accumulated weight of everything that came before. The Sunday dinner had not been my idea originally. It had been Delia's mother-in-law's idea, a woman named Constance Voss, who believed strongly in the restorative power of family gatherings and who had extended the invitation to me, through Delia, approximately 2 weeks earlier. Constance was not an unkind woman. She was the kind of woman who organized things, dinners, opinions, outcomes, with the efficient certainty of someone who had never had serious cause to doubt her own judgment. She had known Gerald for years. They played golf together occasionally, Gerald and her husband Frank. She had, in the weeks after the filing, expressed sympathy for me in the warm and slightly distant way of someone who has decided which side of a situation they're on while maintaining the language of neutrality. I had no particular feelings about Constance Voss, one way or the other. She was peripheral to what mattered. But she had inadvertently created the setting, and for that I was, in a specific and practical way, grateful. Delia's house was in a suburb 40 minutes north, a nice neighborhood, good schools, the kind of place where the houses had two-car garages, and the lawns were kept by services rather than the people who lived there. Delia's husband, a man named Peter Voss, was an operations manager at a logistics company and a genuinely pleasant person who had the particular quality of going along with the people around him without strong feelings in either direction. He was not the issue. He had never been the issue. I arrived at 5:40 on Sunday, which was 10 minutes before Constance and Frank, and I brought a bottle of wine that Beverly's paralegal had recommended, nothing ostentatious, just correct. Delia answered the door in the way she answered doors when she was managing something internally, completely composed on the surface, eyes doing a quick inventory of what I was wearing, what I was carrying, what state I appeared to be in. You look better, she said, and she meant it. I had found a room to rent by then, a single room in a house owned by a retired schoolteacher named Marguerite, who charged $800 a month and asked very few questions, and I had slept in an actual bed for 3 weeks, and the difference was apparently visible. Thank you, I said. The room is working out. She led me into the kitchen to help with something, which was her way of having a conversation she'd been preparing. I could tell by the way she positioned herself at the counter, half turned toward me, hands busy with a salad that didn't need much attention. Constance invited Gerald's brother, she said, not Gerald. Gerald's brother, a man named Theo Ferreira, who was 3 years younger than Gerald and had been, for most of the marriage, Gerald's de facto advisor on everything including the divorce. I set the wine on the counter. Okay. She looked at me sideways. I thought you should know. I appreciate that. She turned back to the salad. Her hands moved steadily. Are you going to be all right? I looked at my daughter, at the careful set of her shoulders, the control in her movements, the specific tension of someone who is braced for a scene they believe is coming, and I felt for a moment something uncomplicated and true. She was trying to protect me. Even now, even with all the ways she had underestimated me, she was trying to protect me in the only way she knew how, which was by managing the environment and preparing me for diminished expectations. I'm going to be completely fine, I said, and I meant it in a register she did not yet have access to. Constance and Frank arrived at 10 minutes to 6. Theo Ferreira and his wife, a quiet woman named Renata, arrived 5 minutes after that. Peter's brother and sister-in-law came last, which put 8 people at a dining table that comfortably seated 8, which meant there was no arrangement of chairs that would allow anyone to leave early without it being noticed. Constance had brought flowers. She set them in the center of the table with the practiced ease of a woman who has been bringing flowers to other people's tables for 40 years and knows exactly how to make it feel like her table by extension. She hugged me at the door, a warm hug, genuinely warm, and held my arms and looked at my face and said, "Nora, you are handling all of this with such grace." "Thank you, Constance," I said. Theo Ferreira shook my hand. He was a compact man with Gerald's coloring, and none of Gerald's polish, rougher around the edges, more direct in his manner, which I had always found slightly easier to deal with than the polished version. He looked at me the way men look at women they have assessed and found manageable. Nora. That was all, just my name as a greeting, as a categorization. Theo, I said, same register. He seemed faintly surprised by it. We sat. Peter poured wine. Delia brought out the first course, and the table settled into the rhythm of a family dinner, overlapping conversations, the passing of bread, the comfortable noise of people who know each other well enough not to perform for each other. I sat between Frank Voss and Renata Ferreira, which placed me diagonally from Theo, which was not an accident. I had looked at the table layout when I came in to help Delia, and I had shifted my place card 2 seats to the left when she went back to the kitchen, and Renata had arrived after the cards were set and had taken the seat next to mine without comment. I ate my salad. I listened. I watched Theo talk about a development project in the city, something Gerald was involved in peripherally. Theo said, still active, still moving forward, and I watched the way he said it, the ease of it, the confidence of a man who has been assured that the ground is stable. My phone was in my jacket pocket. Beverly had sent the documents to a secure file share at 4:30 that afternoon. She had also, at my request, forwarded a summary to a specific email address that I would be accessing on my phone at a specific point in the evening. I had not yet decided exactly when that point would be. I was watching for it. And then Theo, refilling his wine glass, said something that moved the timeline up by approximately 40 minutes. He had been talking about the development project, the financing structure, the partners, the timeline, and then he paused, and he looked at me across the table with the particular expression of a man about to be kind in a way that isn't, and he said, "You know, Nora, once the settlement is finalized, you might want to think about something smaller. Simpler. Gerald mentioned you've been adjusting." The table shifted, just slightly. The way tables shift when something has been said that everyone felt coming and nobody wanted to be the one to say. Delia set her fork down, not dramatically, just set it down, and her eyes went to her plate. Peter refilled someone's water glass. Constance smoothed the napkin on her lap. I looked at Theo Ferreira. He looked back with the expression of a man who believes he has just said something generous. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said. I reached into my jacket pocket, took out my phone, opened the email from Beverly, and then I looked up and said, "Actually, I'd like to talk about the settlement since you brought it up." Theo's expression didn't change yet. He hadn't understood that the terrain had just shifted in a way that would take him several more seconds to register. "Beverly, Chun filed the amended disclosure with the court on Friday afternoon," I said. "I thought you should probably hear about it from me, since Gerald's attorneys will be getting it Monday morning." The table was very quiet. Not performing quiet, actually quiet, the silence of 8 people who have each, separately, stopped their private train of thought and are now paying attention to the same thing. Theo opened his mouth, closed it. His hand, holding his wine glass, stopped midway to the table. I had not said everything yet. I hadn't said most of it, but I had said enough that the room had changed, and everyone at the table could feel the change even if they couldn't yet name it. I had 3 weeks left before the final hearing. Beverly had the documents. Clifton had the report. Raymond Suarez had the trust paperwork, filed and recorded and sitting in a county courthouse where it had been sitting for 22 months. Everything I had built in silence was about to speak. Theo's wine glass touched the table with a small, precise click. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they have misidentified, a second, recalibrating look that tries to locate where the original assessment went wrong. The amended disclosure, he repeated. Not a question yet, a repetition, which is what people do when they need time. Filed Friday at 4:30 in the afternoon. I kept my voice level and unhurried. Beverly's office confirmed receipt. From across the table, Frank Voss put his fork down. He wasn't involved in the legal proceedings, he was peripheral to all of it, a man who had come to Sunday dinner and found himself in the middle of something else entirely, but he had the instincts of a man who had been in business long enough to recognize when a number was about to change direction. Delia was very still. Her husband Peter had his hand on the table, not touching her but close. Theo cleared his throat. Nora, I don't think this is really you brought up the settlement. My voice carried no particular emphasis, just a statement of sequence. I'm following the thread you started. Constance Voss, from her end of the table, made a small sound that might have been the beginning of an attempt to redirect the conversation. She looked at her husband. Frank gave her the smallest possible shake of his head. Renata Ferreira, who had been quiet through dinner in the way of someone practicing careful silence, turned her water glass in a slow circle on the tablecloth. Once, twice. Then she stopped. The amended disclosure relates to the consulting fee structure, I said. Specifically, the transfers from Ferreira Strategic Partners LLC to a personal account held at a bank in Nevada. Clifton Ockeffer, he's the forensic accountant Beverly retained, documented the full picture over the last 6 weeks. Theo's jaw tightened, not dramatically, just the faint shift of someone applying internal pressure to a structure they want to hold in place. Gerald's attorneys are aware of Clifton's engagement, he said. This is a litigation matter, Nora. It's not appropriate dinner conversation. You're right. I folded my hands on the table. I'll be brief. If you're still with me, stay, because what I did in the next 60 seconds is the reason I am telling you this story. I took my phone from my jacket pocket. I opened the email from Beverly. I turned the screen toward Theo, not all the way, just enough that he could see the document attached, and I said, the total documented figure is $1.1 million. That's what Clifton found when he went through all of it, not the 480,000 from the initial discovery. The full number. The table went quiet in the way of a room where 8 people have each, individually, stopped breathing at slightly different moments. Theo looked at the phone. His face did not collapse or crumple. What it did was something more specific and more telling. It went careful. The way a face goes careful when it is recalculating very quickly which things it is safe to confirm and which things it needs to deny, and when it finds that the list of safe confirmations is shorter than expected. That number, he started, has been submitted to the court, I said, along with documentation of the Delaware LLC, the Nevada account, and the 3-year transfer history. Beverly filed everything Friday. Gerald's attorneys will receive it Monday morning. Renata set her water glass down. Her hand stayed on it, not releasing it like she needed the anchor. Delia looked up at me from across the table. Her expression was not what I expected. It was not embarrassment or anger. It was something rawer than that, something that looked, around the edges, like the specific shock of a person who has been confidently wrong about something for a long time and is only now beginning to understand the dimensions of that wrongness. Mom, she said quietly, just that. I know, I said, and I meant it as gently as it's possible to mean a thing. Theo pushed back slightly from the table. Not standing, just repositioning, the way people reposition when they want to signal movement without committing to it. Nora, whatever Clifton Ockeffer thinks he found, I can send you the report. I put my phone on the table, screen down. Beverly has no objection to that. It's going to be public record within the week anyway. He looked at the phone, then at me, then at the phone again. His hand came up to his face, not covering it, just resting at his jaw for a moment in a gesture I recognized as one he shared with his brother. Gerald did the same thing when he was working through a problem he hadn't anticipated. Constance, to her credit, tried. Perhaps this is something that should be handled through the proper channels, and we can. It is being handled through the proper channels, I said, turning toward her without any particular edge. Beverly is handling it. I mentioned it here because Theo asked about the settlement, and I thought he should have accurate information before Monday. Frank Voss made a short, quiet sound that was not quite a laugh. Constance looked at him sharply. He picked up his wine and looked at the middle distance. Theo's voice came out lower than before and with a different quality, the quality of a man speaking from behind a recalculation rather than from in front of one. Gerald is going to want to respond to this. That's his right, I said. He has counsel. So do I. The dinner did not end immediately. These things never do. There was a dessert course that Delia had made, a simple cake that nobody ate more than a few bites of, and there was the slow, effortful reconstruction of small talk that happens when a gathering has been permanently altered, but the physical logistics of chairs and coats and goodbyes still need to be managed. Theo and Renata left first. Theo shook my hand at the door. The handshake was brief, and his grip was different than it had been when he arrived, slightly less certain, like a man who has just discovered that the floor he was standing on is not the floor he thought it was. Renata touched my arm on the way out. She didn't say anything. She just touched my arm, and I understood that she was not entirely surprised, and I felt a brief, uncomplicated sympathy for her. After they left, after Constance and Frank had gone, Constance hugging me at the door again. The hug this time containing something slightly different, a recalibration I could feel in the slight extra pressure of it. And after Peter's brother and his wife had said their goodbyes with the careful cheerfulness of people who have decided to pretend they were at a different dinner than the one that actually occurred, Delia and I sat alone at her kitchen table. Peter had gone to put their youngest to bed. It was just us and the remnants of dessert and the kind of quiet that comes after something has permanently shifted. How long have you known? Her voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of someone asking a genuine question they are not entirely sure they want the full answer to. About the consulting fees? Since November of last year when Beverly found the initial figure. About the full amount since Thursday. She looked at her hands on the table. And the property on Millbrook Road. I paused. You know about that? Raymond Suarez's office called me 2 months ago to update the trust records. She looked up. I didn't know what to say to you. I didn't know. She stopped, started again. I told you nobody would hire you. You were trying to protect me, I said, in the way you knew how. I was trying to get you to stop hoping for something I thought was impossible. Her voice had gone slightly uneven. I didn't know you had already built the thing I was telling you to stop hoping for. There was a long silence, not uncomfortable exactly, more like the silence of two people taking stock. The hearing is in 3 weeks, I said. It's going to go the way it's going to go. Beverly is good at what she does. I know. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was much younger, not quite an apology, but the face someone makes when they are in the early stages of understanding that an apology is owed and are working out the shape of it. I'm sorry, Mom. For what I said about the job, about all of it. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine for a moment. I know, I said again. I drove back to Marguerite's in the dark. The Civic handled the highway the way it always did, reliably, without drama, and I kept the radio off and let myself think about the next 3 weeks in the specific, tactical way that Beverly had taught me was more useful than any amount of feeling. I called Beverly from the driveway. How did it go? She asked. Theo knows the number, I said. He'll call Gerald tonight. Gerald's attorneys will be ready when the documents arrive Monday. That's fine, we want them ready. A pause. Are you all right? Yes, I said, and it was true in the way that practical truths are true, not complete, not without complexity, but solid, something you could stand on. File everything Monday morning. We go with the original timeline. Already planned, Beverly said. Get some sleep, Nora. I sat in the car for a few minutes after I hung up. The lights in Marguerite's house were on. She kept late hours, reading in the front room, and there was something grounding about that. The simple fact of a lit window in a house where someone was going about their evening without drama or calculation. 3 weeks. Everything I had built was about to be tested, and I already knew how it was going to end. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late November. The courthouse was a 40-minute drive from Marguerite's, and I arrived early enough to sit in Beverly's conference room for 20 minutes before we went in, going through the documents one final time with the thoroughness of someone who has already memorized every page but finds the repetition steadying rather than redundant. Clifton Ockaffer was there. He had prepared a summary exhibit, a single page that distilled the forensic report into its essential architecture. The LLC registration date, the first transfer, the last transfer, the total. $1.1 million, give or take what Beverly's motion characterized as reasonable estimate pending final audit. The actual figure, Clifton believed, was closer to 1.2. Gerald arrived with 2 attorneys. He had the look of a man who has been briefed extensively on a situation he would prefer not to be in, and who has arranged his face into the expression of someone who is merely present for administrative purposes. He did not look at me directly when he came in. He looked slightly past me, in the way of someone who has decided that looking at a specific thing directly will make it more real than they are currently prepared for it to be. His lead attorney, a man named Douglas Kwan, had filed a response to Beverly's amended disclosure on Tuesday morning. The response characterized Clifton's findings as overstated and the transfer structure as standard business practice within the scope of an active LLC. Beverly had reviewed it Tuesday afternoon and described it to me in 2 words. They're scared. The judge assigned to our case was a woman named the Honorable Margaret Effiong, who had been on the family court bench for 14 years and who had, Beverly told me, a particular impatience for financial obfuscation in divorce proceedings. She's seen this before, Beverly said. Many times, she knows what a Delaware LLC looks like when it exists for one purpose. We sat, the proceedings began. I am not going to walk through every minute of what happened in that hearing room, because most of it was procedural, attorneys presenting, responding, the judge asking specific technical questions that Douglas Quan answered with the slightly overconstructed fluency of a man whose answer has been prepared in advance for a question that is not quite the one being asked. What I will tell you is what the room felt like, and what it felt like was this. It felt like the moment before a structure you've known was unstable finally acknowledges its own instability. Beverly presented the amended disclosure. She walked Judge Effiong through the transfer timeline. She presented Clifton's exhibit. She was precise and unhurried, and she did not editorialize because she didn't need to. The numbers editorialized on their own. Douglas Quan objected twice. The judge overruled both objections with the same expression. Not impatient, exactly, but final in the way of someone who has heard this particular argument before and has already decided what she thinks of it. Gerald, at the table across from ours, had been very still for most of the first hour. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, which I recognized as a deliberate choice, a conscious effort at stillness that was, in its very deliberateness, the opposite of stillness. And then Beverly said the words that shifted everything. Your Honor, I would also like to draw the court's attention to the Millbrook Road Property Trust, established in January of 2 years ago, which has been the subject of a challenge from the Respondents' Council. The trust was executed within the full legal rights of the petitioner as a co-owner of the property, was properly documented and filed, and was executed prior to any formal divorce proceedings. The property appraised at $420,000. The beneficiary of the trust is the petitioner's biological daughter. Douglas Quan was on his feet. Your Honor, the respondent's position is that this transfer was, I've reviewed the documentation, Mr. Quan. Judge Effiong's voice had the quality of a door closing, not unkind but definitional. Sit down. He sat. Gerald turned his head very slightly, not toward me, toward the window. His profile was composed in the way of a man applying everything he has to the task of composure, and I could see, in the set of his jaw, that the task was taking everything he had. The hearing lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. It took another 6 weeks for the settlement to be finalized, which is the reality of legal proceedings. The decisive moment in a courtroom is not the same as the moment the paper is signed. But the shape of it was determined in that room on that Thursday morning, and everyone in the room understood that. The final settlement gave me 63% of the documented marital assets, which reflected the hidden asset finding and the LLC structure that Judge Effiong had characterized in her written notes as a deliberate and systematic effort to diminish the petitioner's share of the marital estate. Beverly had framed the settlement number on the wall of her office, she told me, as her favorite outcome of the year. I believed her. The Millbrook Road property stayed in the trust. It was not contested after the hearing. Gerald's attorneys withdrew the challenge the following Monday morning. Gerald himself did not contest the final settlement number. Beverly suspected, and I agreed, that Douglas Quan had advised him that contesting it would invite a deeper audit of the Nevada account, the details of which had not yet been fully explored. Sometimes the threat of the next thing is more useful than the thing itself. What I know is that he signed on a Tuesday afternoon in December, in a conference room 3 floors below Beverly's office, and Beverly called me at 2:47 in the afternoon to tell me. I was at Marguerite's. I was sitting at the kitchen table helping Marguerite with a crossword puzzle she had a Thursday when she'd been working on for 2 days, and when Beverly called, I stepped outside onto the front step in the cold and listened. It's done, Beverly said. It's done, I repeated. There was a brief silence that was not uncomfortable. Go celebrate, Beverly said. You've earned it. I went back inside and finished the crossword with Marguerite, and we had tea, and I did not tell her the details because she had never asked for them, which was one of the reasons the room had suited me so well. That was 14 months ago. Gerald's forensic accounting case did not end with the settlement. Beverly had referred the Nevada account documentation to the appropriate authorities in December, a referral she had been planning since Clifton completed his report. And by the following spring, Gerald was facing a separate proceeding that had nothing to do with our divorce and everything to do with the source and nature of certain transfers that Clifton had flagged as potentially outside the consulting fee structure entirely. I am not able to speak to the specifics of that proceeding because it is ongoing and Beverly has advised me not to, but I can tell you that Gerald's development projects are on hold and that Theo Ferreira has been conspicuously quiet on the subject of his brother's business for the better part of a year. I moved out of Marguerite's in February. I bought a condo, modest, a two-bedroom in a building I liked on a street with good light, and I paid for it in a way that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a decision made on my own terms. Delia and I have dinner most Sundays now. Not at her house, usually, often at mine, or at a restaurant near her place that we both like. The conversations are different than they were. Not entirely repaired, these things don't repair the way a broken object does, cleanly and completely, but rebuilt, which is a different process, and I think a more honest one. She has never brought up what she said about nobody hiring me at my age. I have never brought it up either. It sits between us not as an unresolved thing, but as a thing that has already been answered, and that answer is not the kind that requires words. My real estate license, which I had kept current through everything because Beverly had advised me early on to maintain every professional standing I had, has been useful in the past 14 months in ways I did not anticipate. I am not building an empire. I am not trying to. I am working, doing the thing I have always been good at a pace that suits me, with a clarity about what I own and what I have built that I did not have for the last decade of my marriage. Some mornings I drive past the Millbrook Road property. The building is fully occupied. It has been for years because I managed it well. It belongs to a trust with Delia's name on it, and when the time comes for it to be hers in any practical sense, it will be worth considerably more than $420,000. I don't think about Gerald often. When I do, what I feel is not bitterness or satisfaction or any of the things people expect you to feel. It's closer to the feeling of having solved a problem correctly, a clean, quiet sense of completion that doesn't need anyone else to validate it. The car is gone, by the way. I donated the Civic to an organization that gives reliable transportation to people who need it for work. It ran well. I hope it still does. So, did I go too far by surfacing everything at that dinner table in front of his family before his attorneys had a chance to prepare? Or did I not go nearly far enough and should have moved the moment I understood what was being done to me? Tell me in the comments.